Welcome to this first session on contemporary issues of interest to progressives. Today we are going to talk about the two urgent topics that are not always dealt with fully in the media: ecological agriculture and our forever wars. We have with us three persons who have devoted much of their adult lives to these issues and who are authorities on their topics. First of all, we have Francis Thicke. He is a soil scientist, a dairy farmer, and the author of a recent book, A New Vision for Iowa Food and Agriculture. Next, we have Quinn Dilkes. She has off and on for 60 years devoted herself to progressive and peace activism. And finally, we have David Hempel. He is the co-president of the local chapter of Veterans for Peace. He has been a long-standing peace activist ever since the Vietnam War. So, first up, we will have an initial statement from Francis Thicke, and after that, it's game on for whatever people ask.
Thank you, Florence. Well, just to open it up, I would like to mention that agriculture really could be a great way for us to put carbon into the soil. As a matter of fact, since the Industrial Revolution, agriculture has taken a tremendous amount of carbon out of the soil. And between land use changes and agriculture, we've lost as much carbon from the soil as it will take to get carbon back down to 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. So that's a huge amount that we've lost from the soil. And we have tremendous potential that if we could change our farming practices, we could sequester a lot of carbon in the soil. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to stop using fossil fuels. We do, of course. But this is a way if we stop using fossil fuels, we'll stop putting more into the atmosphere. But this way is some way we can put it back into the soil. And we can talk more as we go, but our industrial agriculture is so entrenched that it's not going to be something we can do easily overnight. Did you want me to continue on?
Sure.
Continue on with it? Okay, good. Well, in Iowa, we've lost about half of our soil to erosion since we started farming, and about 60% of that organic carbon has been lost to the atmosphere. So we've been deficit spending our ecological capital all these years. And so the thing is that we have to reverse that process, because with our industrial agriculture, we're going in the wrong direction. As Wendell Berry said, we took an elegant solution in the past of animals integrated on the landscape in a way that's ecologically sound and broken it up into two problems. One of industrial livestock production, where we have our animals all in confinement, and the other one is industrial crop production, which causes a lot of problems, including water quality problems. So we need to find a way to bring those back together again, which is not going to be easy. But when you think about how we got our soils, Iowa, we like to brag that we have some of the best soils in the world. But 12,000 years ago, when the last glacier left northern Iowa, there wasn't any soil at all. It was a geologic wasteland. The glacier had just churned all this material down from Canada and Minnesota and dropped it. And only as plants and animals colonized that loose geologic material did it actually begin to create soil. And in 12,000 years, we created these most productive soils in the world. And so we can see that's how nature generated soils. And so we've been degrading them, but if we want to, the buzzword today is regenerative agriculture. So we need to regenerate our soils using those same processes that nature's ecology used. And if we look at, for example, animals grazing, I have a dairy farm, and we graze our cows very intensely. We have about 60 small pastures, so twice a day the cows get new grass, and they keep moving around, and it regrows. It's kind of like what happened with our soils. Is we know the prairie grasses were very tall and very deep-rooted, but when the bison would come in and graze it off, then it was short, and it didn't need all that root mass, so it sloughed some of that off into the ground, grow new tops, new roots. And so over time, it pulsed that organic matter with all these grazing episodes deep in the soil, creating these black, rich soils. And the key thing is that these are perennial crops, is that the prairie grasses were perennial. They had live roots in the soil year-round. Whereas if we look at industrial agriculture today, corn and soybeans covers 2/3 of our land surface in Iowa, but they only grow for about 5 months of the year. So during most of the year, there are no live roots there. And so not only is it a problem for water quality, because when the rainfall percolates down, it takes the nitrate to the tile drains, to the rivers, to the Gulf of Mexico, but it's not resilient at all. So with a grazing system, what we've done, we brought the animals back on the landscape, and we follow that same process. We let the grasses grow up, and then the cows graze it off, and then they move on, and then it grows a new top and more roots. And so we're starting to rebuild the soils. And so that's a way we can do that. But you can see that in Iowa we have 23 million acres of corn and soybeans, and we have 60 million chickens in cages, and we have about 24 million hogs in confinement. And so we've gone the opposite direction. And so we really need to find a way to get the animals back on the livestock back on the landscape in ways that are ecologically sound. So that's what, it's a challenge, but I think we can do it, and we need to do it in the future.
I was really interested in the account in your book of how things had changed since the Second World War. Because as a child, I can remember going out to the farms of the various family members, and there were pigs and chickens and all sorts of discussions of crop rotation. And you point out very well, I thought, how a confluence of economic factors made the transition, the extreme transition to industrial agriculture more prominent. And I think most people who live in cities are not aware of the radical nature of this change. So I wondered if you could explain a little bit about these forces.
And the changes are going on even faster today. In the last year, we've lost many dairy farms, family dairy farms. And we're seeing instead that the dairy cows are being put into big confinements of 10 to 15,000 cows in one place. And that's where they stay. And the feed is brought to the cows, and the manure has to be taken care of somewhere. Whereas when the animals are on the landscape, they put the manure where it needs to be, and it builds the soil rather than degrades it. But several factors making this happen. One is that we see increasing concentration of the marketplace. We see, like, for example, beef and pork production and processing. About 3 or 4 companies control almost 100%, or 60 to 80% of the market. And ag economists tell us that when 4 or fewer corporations control 40 or more percent of the market, it starts to act like a monopoly. And so we have monopoly control of our markets, and we have overproduction. Our biggest problem we've had in agriculture in the last 70 years is too much production of commodity crops. So the price goes to the floor, and the farmers go out of business. And the big ones that have a lot of capital can weather that. So we're seeing a falling away of the family farmers that don't have the capital to weather these downturns. And we see a growing number of the big, large corporate farms. And so this is accelerating. And it's also accelerating putting animals in the confinements, in the CAFOs, as we call them, concentrated animal feeding operations. Because when the price of corn and soybeans goes way down so cheap, it's cheap feed for these hog confinements. And so they can buy it cheap. And so our policies we have today are ways that really foster industrial agriculture, not only crop production, but animal production. So we're in a deep hole here, and we're not coming out. We're going in deeper now.
In your book, you mentioned that under the Obama administration, you had a little bit of hope that there would be a change in policy. My guess is that there hasn't been a radical change in policy.
I don't remember that I had that statement, but the truth is that I was disappointed with the way things went during the Obama administration. I had great hopes, but we lost a lot of things in agriculture, and even the organic standards were degraded during the Obama administration in many ways. And so I'm working with a group of farmers that are trying to bring the organic standards back up to the original intent of the law that created them. But they eroded during the Obama administration, and they eroded much more quickly during the Trump administration. For example, we had an animal welfare standard ready in the organic standards, ready to go. And the Obama administration dragged their feet, and then they saw that the Democrats were going to lose, and so they quickly put it in at the end of 2018. And then as soon as Trump administration came in, they threw it out and was gone. And so, the problem here is that we know that the lobbyists for big food and agribusiness are in the back door of the USDA offices in Washington, and they're making their stand, and they're getting the ear of this administration and the past administration. So they're getting their way on things, and so it's very unfortunate.
It's obvious that a part of your means of addressing this would be to improve organic standards. But I want to ask a larger question. If you ran the Department of Agriculture and the government, what 3 or 4 things would you do? People need a takeaway. What major changes in policy could the government bring about that would alter these consolidation and monopoly
Well, that's a good
processes?
question, because I actually worked at U.S. Department of Agriculture as a soil science program leader for 4 years, from 88 to 92. So I kind of saw how it works from the inside. The thing people don't understand, not only with agriculture department, but other departments, is that there's so much that could be done just with routine administration. There are like $2 billion worth of research grants that go out every year. And so the priorities for that could be switched so that the priority is regenerative agriculture. The organic standards could be fixed overnight with a Secretary of Agriculture that wanted to do it. And conservation programs could be revamped. A lot of things could be done without any congressional action. And even things like some of the subsidies, the way they're allocated, they could be revamped. And so there's a lot that could be done. Not only the Department of Agriculture, but other departments like Energy, EPA. There are so many things that could be done just with routine administration without taking Congress to make a law change.
Well, I have heard that the government pours its subsidies into corn and soybean, but that it doesn't cover things like cover crops. So, it's a big investment or hemp. It's a big investment for somebody to put out thousands of dollars of something. So it'd make a big difference if the government changed its subsidies policies.
Well, it's true that government policies have been pushing agriculture the way it's going, but now there are some subsidies for cover crops. But that's really kind of a Band-Aid. The problem is that our whole system is really flawed. And so we often look at conservation practices like catching the nitrate at the bottom of the field with biofilters or wetlands, and some of us call those conservation diapers, because we're not really doing it right on the field, and so we have to catch the runoff on the end. So we really need to fix it more fundamentally, more systemically. But subsidies could be changed. We could, for example, tie subsidies for agriculture to environmental practices. So you don't get a subsidy unless you use a cover crop or more diverse rotations that will actually meet our goals for water quality too. What I have been advocating for is that every farm already has a soil conservation plan on the farm. Not every farm, but most farms do. That means that they meet their goals for soil erosion. And with that, we've reduced our erosion quite a bit. It's not where it needs to be. The enforcement is weak. But we could have a water quality plan at every farm. So that every farm would have to look at the problems that are on the farm and could pick and choose any kind of practices, but would have to meet a goal for nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So that if every farm could meet that goal, then we would, on the aggregate, meet our goals of nitrogen and phosphorus loss. It could be done very well. There's a pretty good research database. That's more than we have time to talk about here, but that's an exciting thing I think we could do in the future is require farms to have water quality plans and tie that to subsidies, and so that they would meet the water quality goals on each individual farm.
So you're telling me that we already have such requirements for soil, but not for water?
The 1985 Farm Bill said that any farmer who gets subsidies has to have a soil conservation plan if they have highly erodible land. A lot of farms, have some highly erodible land, so they have to have a conservation plan for that land to meet the goals for soil erosion on that highly erodible land. So we already have that. And so, see, one objection farm organizations have is that farmers can't be regulated because you can't have one regulation. You can't have one regulation for all farms because one size doesn't fit all. Every farm's different. Well, that's true. That's why a water quality plan would give farmers flexibility. They could choose any practices they want. And the research data tell us how effective these practices are. So we could put all that data in a computer program, like with the soil conservation plans. We have a huge computer program that farmers put their practices in there and spits out a predicted soil erosion level. Farmers could put their practices in, and it would estimate what the loss of nitrate would be and the loss of phosphorus. And if they didn't meet the goal, then they would have to change their practices until they got an answer that would meet the goals. And we have the data here in Iowa to be able to predict what the nitrogen loss and phosphorus loss would be for various practices.
Okay, if you could predict who would be the next president of the United States, and that person happened to stop by your farm, and you could give them therefore little bits of advice, then I think you would suggest to them that they put into place or try to put into place a soil and water management plan for the entire United States.
Well, that's part of it, yes. There are other things. We need to break up the monopolies of the big ag industries. There are quite a
And
few
how
things.
would we do that?
Well, trust busting, like Teddy Roosevelt did. Really, that's what it would take. So there are quite a few things we need, and rural America is really falling apart. It's being abandoned. The truth is, if you look at it from the bigger perspective, agriculture today isn't working for farmers. They're going broke at record numbers. It's not working for rural communities. They're being vacated. It's not working for the environment. So who's it working for? It's working for the big corporations that they're extracting the resources out of the communities and putting them into their own coffers. And so they're selling internationally with the Cargills, the ADMs, the Smithfield Farms of the world. They're the ones that are actually reaping the benefits of agriculture.
Great. Well, thank you for these thoughts. We can come back to these later, but this gives us a radical view of how we need to transform agriculture rather than put a Band-Aid on some small little excrescence here and there. So, a major topic that occupies the mind of all thinking people is the United States foreign policy on war. And so I wanted to ask Quinn Dilkes to give us some sense of what the problem is so that we can then discuss it.
Thank you. Well, to begin with, since 9/11, our military has been engaged in a so-called war on terror, as we know. But what is not widely known is that this war on terror, according to research from Brown University, has now been extended into 80 different countries. We are said to have killed at least 1 million civilians in these wars, not to mention those maimed and displaced. We are now spending at least $1 trillion a year on war, far, far more than any other country in the world. Add to that, according to academic David Vine's research, we have over 800 military bases around the globe. This is far more than any of the countries presented to us as grave threats to our security: Russia, China, Iran. So exaggeration of those threats, as we're seeing with Russiagate, is then used to justify more military spending, used also to dismiss the need for negotiation. And as part of all this, we also have an entirely unaccountable, corrupt CIA working hand in glove with our military around the world. This is a CIA that uses murder, torture, sexual violence, even mind control to terrorize populations, promote war. CIA is also deep into illegal drugs, arms, and sex trafficking operations. So, for more on CIA crimes, you could look at the longtime research of Alfred McCoy, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin. Also books by, among others, Douglas Valentine, Medea Benjamin, Max Blumenthal, Dan Kovalich, Kathy O'Brien, most recently Stephen Kinzer. So a big part of the problem is that our military has become so good at hiding its wars, our wars, that large sections of the population are not aware of how widespread they are and how much death and suffering they cause. And this is one reason I believe that we are not seeing the kind of mass anti-war protests that rose up during our war on Vietnam. This exactly 50 years ago. I remember in 1969 being at a peace rally in Washington, D.C. with 500,000 people. And I believe this desperately needs to happen again. So how is this cover-up accomplished? For starters, having learned from Vietnam when veterans made up a large portion of the peace movement, the military has abolished the draft. They're also depending more on air power and unmanned drones, methods which allow warriors to kill at minimal risk to themselves. This surely in part so fatalities will be a little less evident. Yet still covered up is the fact that there are fatalities, many soldiers returning home dead or severely injured, many committing suicide. And right here in Des Moines, Iowa, I might add, is a little-known drone station where soldiers sit at computers and kill people thousands of miles away. And yet even those soldiers suffer from PTSD. So most importantly, the war party has gotten control of the mass media, which is virtually silent regarding America's worldwide military expansion. And while this mass media may seem to be covering our Middle East wars, it is too often, I believe, simply promoting the lies used to justify the wars. At the same time, the mass media propagates the notion that we're the good guys, driven only to protect our security at home and spread democracy around the world. Never mind our government's alliance with some of the most autocratic governments in the world. Never mind our government's violent interference in scores and scores of other countries' affairs. Media silence regarding CIA crimes is particularly extreme. This in part because the 1947 National Security Act that created our current CIA granted it impunity from ever being held accountable. This because they claimed that secrecy was necessary for national security. As a result, for years and years, the CIA has been free to do whatever it wants, and thus, tragically, has become a covert criminal organization. Also, the war party, which rakes in billions of dollars from war, has also gotten control of Congress, so that year after year we see bipartisan support for huge military budgets and war. And in fact, the 2016 election, military spending and war were not even mentioned by either major party. Only Jill Stein of the Green Party spoke out against our wars. This year, we are at least hearing war mentioned once in a while by a few Democratic candidates. But Tulsi Gabbard, the candidate who speaks out the most firmly against America's regime change wars, has been incredibly, blatantly smeared by the media, including by the New York Times. And like Jill Stein in the 2016 election, Tulsi Gabbard is now being portrayed without any evidence whatever as some sort of Russian pawn. So I should add that options for getting the truth do exist. We have many excellent local and national peace organizations, investigative journalists, some wise academics, alternate media outlets, veterans, whistleblowers, and on and on. But these sources are rarely cited responsibly by the mainstream media. So I think it's really important to remember that it does take a little extra work to get even part of the truth about our war and its connections with other issues.
Great. Well, that's an absolutely horrific list of the problems that face us, not only in our complicity with these wars, but in finding out about this. Mm-hmm. One thing struck me in listening to your account of the ways in which the U.S. government manages to mask our wars, and that's the use of mercenaries. Mm-hmm. Because it used to be that everyone who fought one of our wars was a soldier and had the various benefits therefrom, but also a certain amount of publicity when atrocities were committed.
Right.
But now
Absolutely.
Blackwater and some of those other organizations do, as far as I can tell, kill a lot of people, mm-hmm. Civilians, unnecessarily in various places. And it gets a tiny bit of mention in the media, but it's not framed as something that we ourselves have done.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the volunteers tend to be poor, disadvantaged people. So in a way, it's a draft of poor.
Yes,
people.
The poverty draft.
Poverty draft, yeah.
The military has a very good sense of how to lure those people into the military too. You know, they have these slick commercials on TV. You've probably seen them, mm-hmm. about join the Navy, join the Marines, whatever. You know, what does it take to become a Marine? There's the macho line, but there's lots of Navy commercials I've seen that are trying to enlist women, mm-hmm. more than ever.
Make it look glamorous, huh?
That's right. They make them look. It just makes it look like everybody's saluting and everybody's, you know.
They're also, I understand, recruiting in the high schools.
They still are.
Yeah.
They still are.
What I notice in connection with the high cost of education is that they recruit through promising various training programs. Now, you shouldn't have to be willing to kill people in order to get an education. And it is tragic that so many middle-class people are forced to go into debt for much of their lives now for what used to be considered to be a social good, public education. So I think that many people feel, well, there's no other way that I can train in computers or some specialized field unless I enter the military, and they may not be aware of all the things they will be doing. I know a tragic case of a friend who enlisted, and he was in charge of being a translator for torture sessions, and he collapsed. I mean, he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I'm sure that he's not the only case where the publicity around the effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome have been under-communicated. All the cases of suicides of soldiers who've come back, all the cases of domestic violence, these are horrific things.
So it's over 20 a day now. Veterans from the Vietnam War only who've taken their own lives. 20.
Wow.
It's up to
Oh
23
my
a
gosh.
day on average now.
That's
In old
incredible.
age, then, they're doing
Yes,
this. So it's
yes,
going to
from
happen
age.
to the
That's
Iraq
right.
War veterans, it's going to happen to the Afghanistan War veterans, and
Well, it is already happening to them, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But, that gets put under the rug. We don't like to hear about those things, and you don't hear about them very often. And these ads too that lure the kids in to join the military, they don't talk about anything like that, and they don't talk about the length of the time the government has you. It used to be 3 years when I was there. You enlist for 3 years. Now it's up to 8 in most cases.
Really?
You sign a dotted line and you are the government's property for 8 years. Some of these kids out of high school, I mean, that's a third of their lifetime at that point, if not more. It's unreal.
would you like to say anything more about the effects on
Well-
the veterans themselves?
Just that, with each succeeding administration, we always push for better benefits and better service from the VA, and that's not happening in many places. We have a pretty good local VA hospital here, but in most cases that's shoveled aside too, and veterans don't get the help that they need, both physically and emotionally.
I've read that many of our homeless are veterans.
That's right.
That is shocking, because presumably it's not income alone, but mental illness, which creates veterans roaming
And
the
it doesn't have to
streets.
be deep mental illness. I mean, I know several people in this area who are basically homeless. They're just single guys who just wander around looking for a place to stay, and it's really sad.
It seems really tragically ironic that we're willing to spend so much money for military equipment in wars, but then we get so stingy when it comes to taking care of the people who come back from the wars.
Another thing is concerning agriculture worldwide. We have 800 plus bases all over the world, many in the Pacific. We practically own the Pacific Islands, the little tiny islands everywhere, and they're all fuel bases. We can stop there for anything on our way to bombing China or whoever in the future. We've got it all set up. But where we've been, like Okinawa or Hiroshima, those places, and Vietnam with Agent Orange, their soil used to be very rich and wonderful for their farmers. Now they don't have anything left. The ground is toast. It's just worthless in those places for the most part, and that's due to the American military.
Some of those islands, they've simply displaced the population.
That's correct.
Right?
That's right.
Or it's become completely unlivable,
Completely
also from the
unlivable.
nuclear
Yes,
testing. Yeah.
all kinds of birth defects, and
Yeah.
people live their lives, but it's horribly what it should be.
I'd like to recommend a book by, if I'm saying her name right, Stacy Bannerman, Homefront 9/11. And she talks about, because the veterans are not given adequate help with PTSD, and so it often gets left to the wife of the veterans, and she describes just the hell that these families live with.
Yeah.
Just all kinds of horrible experiences, and some of these women are committing suicide too.
Wow.
Our government is really good at covering up all those bad stories.
Oh yeah, right.
I know, Quinn, that you've given thought to the effects, the long-term intersectional effects of war. So it isn't just that we are invading 80 countries or have presence in 80 countries, but that these effects are wide and intersectional and ongoing. So I wondered if you could discuss such issues as the relationship between our military expenditures and actions in the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, you want just that one?
No, go
Or
ahead.
you want me to go
yeah,
on?
No.
I gotta,
Poverty, race,
I can
everything.
briefly touch on a few of the issues that are discussed, but I think need to be would be better understood if seen in the larger context of war. But any one of these could be discussed for a long time, so I'll slide through them. Well, like climate crisis, we do have a growing, at least hope-inspiring environmental movement, but too frequently left out of the discussion the fact that the military and war are the worst destroyers of the environment in the world, at least as I understand it. Poverty, obviously, so much war spending along with corporate corruption has greatly increased poverty and inequality in the world, and thus all the suffering that involves. Racist violence, in addition to the mass media's inadequate coverage of racial violence in this country, never acknowledges the obvious fact that our past and present wars have been waged primarily against people of color, thus killing, maiming, and displacing millions of them. Little known, for example, just an example, is that our military and CIA are presently active in almost every country in Africa. And
Stunning.
boy, the military works hard to cover that up. And sexual violence. Thank goodness for Me Too and other women working to expose the little recognized widespread sexual violence in this country. But meanwhile, sexual violence also needs to be seen in the wider context of war. I don't think the two issues can be separated. Rape is a tool of war. Wherever there is war, you can be sure there will be massive sexual violence, especially against women and children. Also, sex trafficking and brutal exploitation of women thrive around our military bases. So back home, this essentially patriarchal/military mindset invariably exacerbates sexual violence against women and children, LGBTQ folks, and many others. We're also, and this is hard, we also now seeing ever more evidence of a horrific epidemic of child porn and child rape. This is an epidemic so severe that even the New York Times recently featured a long front page article on the 45 million images of child rape that have appeared on the internet during the past several years. Laurie Handrahan, a PhD social scientist, has written a book called Epidemic: America's Trade in Child Rape. Her research provides evidence that many powerful white men in this country, often those connected with the military, are not only profiting from the porn trade, but are also often themselves engaged in the widespread sadistic torture and rape of children. This, I know, is hard to believe, but the evidence is compelling. And the issue of guns. The movement for gun control in this country is critical, but we need as well to remember the amount of money spent on guns here at home is actually small compared to the amount spent on weapons of war, and certainly these are related issues. With regard to nuclear weapons, I remember back in the 1980s a huge anti-nuke movement, one in which women's and peace movements had joined forces. I remember joining an anti-nuke protest in New York City with 1 million people. But though many are concerned, we no longer have a large anti-nuke movement. What became of it? Our presidents have pulled us out of arms control agreements, spending ever more on nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, 120 countries in the UN have voted to make nuclear weapons illegal. But it doesn't get into the media, any of this. Drugs, people who are addicted to opioid prescription drugs, I learn, often switch to heroin and opioid because it is cheaper and more available. But this is rarely talked about. Also then covered up, heroin mostly comes from Afghanistan. And trade in heroin is apparently controlled by the CIA in alliance with the drug lords in Afghanistan. And finally, migration. We watch with justifiable horror as Trump scapegoats and tortures migrants on our borders, cruelly separates children from their parents. But too often forgotten or ignored is how our years of bipartisan supported wars have laid a groundwork of mass migration and terror for these current horrors. This especially has been true in Central American countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, from which so many migrants are now fleeing. When I hear about migrants fleeing Central America, I remember back in the 1980s visiting a Costa Rican refugee camp for victims of the war that our military is supporting in El Salvador. And during that visit, one of the women refugees told me, with tears in her eyes, that she back home had found her sister beheaded by what was obviously an American bomb. I can tell you the memory of that woman's story sticks with me like no other from those years. And I suspect this is exactly the kind of image our media leaves out to avoid the rise of empathy and protest among us. As we increasingly question the hierarchical structures under which we live, capitalism, patriarchy, etc., we need to be looking at those structures also in the context of war. We need to see that such systems, like war, promote the notion our safety depends on money, on violence, on control of other individuals and countries, on control of the earth, thus tearing us apart, potentially, separating us from ourselves, from others, from our sacred land. And so just as much we need to be seeking the truth with our minds and our hearts, need to remember with our love and our compassion that we are in fact all part of one another, and that our country's violence hurts others terribly, but is also hurting ourselves.
Thank you. That's a deeply impressive statement and entirely convincing. Wow. And I too fear, not just from empathy, it's awful to kill so many people in a counterproductive way, but it also creates a natural hatred and resentment for generations. When I was a young woman, I was fortunate to be able to teach in several other countries, and I was a Fulbright professor. And my husband and I were always greeted with goodwill because we were Americans. But I have read that of all the countries in the world most feared, it is now the United States. Mm-hmm. Well, we need hope because each person needs each day to do something for their cause. What would you suggest to young peace activists beginning out today, beginning and setting out today, where should they begin in trying to make a difference in persuading our government that we need to have radical change?
Well, I would say being aware of what's going on is a first step. I mean, I think finding the truth is a kind of spiritual journey. And if we live with lies, I think it creates fear.
I think it's harder for that to happen to a lot of people. I think don't have access to real news. I mean, they put something like Fox News on, people eat that stuff up.
Right,
And
and it does take
it really hinders actual coming together and discussing things. And
It's true,
Well, as the co-president of Veterans for Peace, you must be involved in trying to get information out to people that is useful.
We
What
do.
would you suggest as places where people should go to look for accurate information?
Well, we avail ourselves every Friday afternoon at the east side of the Pentecrest, where we hold a vigil/protest against all wars. We have lots of signs that target specific conflicts and specific ideas, but the basic message is peace. We need to converse and try to attain some sort of peace on a one-to-one level. So we talk with lots of folks that bother to stop and talk with us there. We have other outreach programs. We're trying to expand in the schools. Right now we have one day a year when we go to Northwest Junior High and talk to the 8th graders about our version of the military, because they're getting deluged with it, with the party line, which is sign up for the US of A in whatever branch you love. We're trying to tell a different story there.
Do you think you get a good response from these young people?
We often do. There's always a few kids in every class. We usually talk in front of 5 or 6 classes, 45-minute classes. Her entire day, this teacher is so wonderful to let us have her all the classes that she teaches. One 45-minute class is devoted to having us there. So that's, we've made small inroads, and we hope to find ways to let the school district let us in at various other places.
I'm trying to think of ways in which our agriculture policy and our military expenses might overlap. I do remember one interesting fact. At one point, Cuba put its soldiers in the field. It had more soldiers than it could use, and it decided to put them to sustainable peacetime purposes.
It was interesting. I visited Cuba in the late 1990s, and which is, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990 about, and so they had lost all of their industrial agriculture resources from Russia. They had been very industrialized, and like their animals were in feedlots, and they just totally dispersed all that, and they went to totally organic farming because they couldn't get pesticides anymore or fertilizers. And so we visited, I was with an agricultural research group, and we visited their research farm, and they were doing great research on organic farming, and at that time in Havana, every vacant lot was a garden, and people were growing food all over the place because the only alternative was starving because they had lost all the resources. So they had been forced to go into organic farming just because of the policies, with the U.S. I heard that maybe since then that some of the farms, they've become more self-sufficient for food, and a lot of the urban gardens aren't really going anymore. I'm not sure why, but it was interesting to see that kind of interaction between our policies and the food system. But more than that, I think that we have to recognize that we need to allow countries or help countries become food sovereign. We have this mindset in the U.S. that we want to feed the world. And Iowa farmers think that, which is totally wrong. It's not only not true, but it's a wrong mindset. And actually, as a matter of fact, one study looked at where all the corn and soybeans went that came down the Mississippi River, and they found that less than 1%, less than 0.5% went to food deficit countries. It all went to the wealthy countries. And so we're not feeding the world at all, and we shouldn't kid ourselves, and we shouldn't try to feed the world. We should try to help other countries become food self-sufficient, food sovereign. Instead, we have the opposite kind of a thing. We have Monsanto trying to dominate the world food supply by patenting all the seeds and going around the world trying to control the food supply that way, which is totally wrong. Unfortunately, we have some billionaires helping them out with that, with trying to get countries hooked on genetic modification, GMO seeds. And so we need to turn that around too, and see how we can help countries become food self-sufficient instead of trying to dump our food on their economy. For example, when the NAFTA came into place here from the Clinton administration, about 1.5 million Mexican farmers lost their livelihood because they were growing corn locally, selling it locally. When we dumped our corn on the Mexican market below the cost of production, they all went out of business. And where do you think those 1.5 million Mexican farmers ended up going? So that exacerbates the next problem, that they have no place to go but try to get in here to find a job. And then our industrial agriculture, you look at these confinement operations, virtually all those employees doing the work are undocumented workers. And so if they do a bust in one of these CAFOs or the slaughterhouses, I mean, I know people who are on the inside of these slaughterhouses, they said 80% of them are undocumented workers. They have papers, but they're not real papers. And so I'm not knocking them, but you can see how our policies in agriculture have this domino effect and cause all these other problems. And so we're helping out the Cargills and the ADMs of the world, but we're really undermining the economies of other countries.
I just recently heard that Monsanto now gets the World Food Prize in Iowa. Is that right?
Well, I don't know. I haven't been keeping up on it, but it really is the World Industrial Food Prize is what it usually amounts to be. Is that very rarely do they give the prize to somebody who's really doing good work, helping local people. Because research shows that in many of these impoverished countries, if they can just optimize the use of their own internal resources, making their farming more ecologically sound, they can double or triple their production without all these inputs, without these GMOs, without the fertilizers and pesticides. Mm-hmm. Just by using regenerative farming kind of practices, they can double and triple their yields. So imagine that, because we know from research that 75% of the world's population is fed by the peasant food web. Just think of that, 75% of the world's population is fed by these small farmers all around the world. And only 25% of the world's population is fed by industrial agriculture. But on the other hand, industrial agriculture uses 75% of the resources to grow food. And they only feed 25% of the population. So the model of the Monsanto and the World Food Prize mentality is to try to increase this world food production with the industrial model. But we already are causing huge environmental problems with it, with soil erosion and desalinization of the soils and wrecking our aquifers, drying up our aquifers, desertification. And so do we want to increase that? Or do we want to try to increase the local, empower the local people to produce their own food? Mm-hmm. That's the model we need to be pushing for.
That's right. A lot of those local farmers are women.
Most of them around the world are, yeah.
Are
very
they
small.
most?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Very many of them are women, yes.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything we can do as a state, to decentralize the way that the country agriculture is run? I mean, can we make some changes such that some people would feel the benefit?
Well, things that will actually increase local food production are great, because in Iowa we import about 85 to 90% of the food we eat comes from out of state.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Which is ironic, isn't it?
Yes,
it is.
Which is why so many of us like farmers markets, because
Exactly.
that's really the
And
thing.
Iowa has
That's
one of
a real
the
thing.
highest numbers of farmers markets of any state. And so we are doing that good. But a kind of an interesting, funny story is that back when Governor Vilsack was governor, he had this big thing of make Iowa the food capital of the world. Well, Neil Hamilton, who is from Drake University, who is a local food advocate, he told the governor, why don't we first make Iowa the food capital of Iowa? So we're not doing that. But you got to remember that we have tremendous productive capacity here in Iowa. We could probably feed the whole state of Iowa with one county's worth of land. We have 99 counties. So we can't just use it for local food, but we can do it in better ways. And hemp is something that people have talked about before this session started. And I think it has great potential. It's going to take a while to develop an infrastructure, but hemp would be a great new product, a new crop And I just saw just a little article recently how hempcrete they're making concrete hemp box with a mixture of hemp and concrete, and it's very light and it's good insulation, but it takes a whole lot less concrete, and concrete is one of the biggest contributors to carbon in the atmosphere, and so it would reduce the carbon in the atmosphere, and it would also that hemp gets in the concrete. Now it'll be in there, it'll be sequestered for the life of the building, or maybe longer, and so that's a way to sequester carbon too. So and hemp has the seed is valuable for medicinal and for food properties, and so there are a lot of potentials. But to develop the hemp fiber, it takes a huge infrastructure. We've lost all that. During World War II, there was a lot of hemp being used for fiber, so we need to recreate that infrastructure, and I think that'll be great because we're going to need more crops. We only have 2 major crops in Iowa. We need to have more alternatives for rotating crops. But when you think about this too, is that 40% of the corn in Iowa goes to ethanol. And that in itself is a problem in my mind. It's not ecologically sound. But we know that we're switching to electric vehicles, and the futurists tell us that in 10 years we'll have virtually every new car will be electric, because it only has 18 moving parts versus 2,000 for an internal combustion engine, and it'll go about 3 times further, and it'll be a lot cheaper to run. So pretty soon we'll have all electric vehicles. But we have 40% of our corn going to ethanol for internal combustion engine. What are we going to do with agriculture then when we lose that market? And I brought that up with the ethanol industry, and they say, we tried electric cars in the 70s and it didn't work, so it's not going to happen. But so they have their head in the sand, and they're not willing to think about it. And it's going to come down pretty fast that already they have too much ethanol, and ethanol plants are shutting down around Iowa. And so what's going to happen? We have to think ahead, and we have to think about other crops. And hemp could be a really good one if we would develop that infrastructure. That's something we could do on the state level, is help develop that infrastructure and get farmers up and going, because it's not quite as easy to grow as I've seen, as some people may claim.
So I've seen it growing so much corn, using so much corn for ethanol, then tends to raise the price of food in other countries.
Did that.
Is that still
It did that a while ago. Now the price of commodities, corn and everything, is in the dumps. So but it did at one point when the ethanol king came up. Price of food, we took a big spike. Remember there were riots around the world.
And that was food riots and stuff,
yes,
and that was
an
related,
issue.
yeah.
But we have so much
But
production
why is
capacity.
that not,
Because we've overproduced. We've caught up, and we've got more and more, and we've taken more land out of production, out of other things.
Oh, okay.
Out of perennial crops and out of pastures and so on, put it into corn and soybeans. So we've added nationwide more acres of corn.
Which is
Yeah. So we need to think ahead about what we're going to do.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Irony.
I've heard that as we put more and more carbon in the atmosphere, the quality of the soil declines, and without these nutrients, the actual quality of food declines.
Well, the soil, we can build soil up with regenerative agriculture, and many farmers are doing that, making tremendously productive soils. But one thing that happens, research now shows, is that as you get more carbon in the atmosphere, that the food tends to have more carbon in it, and more carbohydrates versus protein. And so it's getting more and more of a starch, changing towards fewer other nutrients and more carbohydrates, which is not good. We already have probably too many carbohydrates in our diet. So that it can change the composition of the food.
And both you and Quinn mentioned GMO. Could you explain just a bit what are some of the negative effects?
Well, GMOs are controversial, and at this point, most of the scientific community, which gets a lot of money from the GMO companies for research, frankly, is still circling the wagons and saying that they're good, they're all good. But there's increasingly research coming up showing health issues, and the scientists who are getting money for doing research on GMOs will pull out all stops to discredit that research. And so I think it's just a matter of time before we begin to realize that it's not quite the panacea that they thought. And then also a lot of claims about GMOs that's going to increase, for example, drought resistance. But it's not. I mean, it's not working. Was it India? Cotton, farmers bought all this GMO cotton that was supposed to be drought resistant, and it failed totally. And so they're trying to sue Monsanto for that. So a lot of claims that aren't true. And we can breed for drought resistance with regular traditional breeding too. We don't have to use GMOs to do that. So a lot of what the claims, there's really nothing to them. They're mostly a way to make money for the GMO companies. If they produce a crop like corn or soybeans that's resistant to the glyphosate, then they can sell not only that crop seed, but then they can sell the glyphosate too. And so it's a good marketing ploy. And that's what they want to do around the world. They want to get, and as they move in and they begin to monopolize the seed market, then all the old indigenous seeds begin to fall away and get lost, which is not good either. I could go on and on, so I'll quit here now.
I had heard
Really big
that
subject.
organic farming requires that you be away from Monsanto or Ready Roundup and those kinds
I'm sorry?
of seeds. I have heard that in order to have an organic farm, you have to be a certain
Oh,
distance
okay,
away
distance,
from
yes.
GMO crops. And this would have a terrible effect on the amount of land that would be available for organic.
Well, with organic, you need to have a
farming.
buffer, and for pesticides, usually it's about 25 feet, so if your neighbor's spraying it, you have a buffer. And so I have some buffers, and so I just have to let that just go. I can't use that land because my neighbor's spraying. But that's okay. But now with GMOs, they can travel a couple miles, something like corn. And so the way organic farmers try to do it are a couple. One is that if you do it, plant a different time. Suppose you plant a little later than most of the other corn, then the other corn will pollinate before yours does, and so yours won't get that cross-contamination. They also have developed a line of corn seed that will not accept pollen from other corn species of varieties. So your corn crop will only pollinate your corn. It won't take anybody. It'll reject the other pollen. So that's something. That's what I've been planting to keep other pollen out of my. So it's a tricky thing. And in organic, now we're looking towards nationally standards for GMOs because there's going to be some contamination, and we need to make some thresholds that say it's no longer organic if it reaches above a certain threshold.
So may I ask, I hear a lot of the point of view that eating meat is just at the center of a lot of our problems. And I like what you say about integrating, because that's the kind of farm I grew up visiting. But it seems like there's a movement among people to just, and I think it's great to be vegan if that's what people are, but is there a tension between those two ways
very
of
good.
looking at things?
That's a very good question, because there is some tension, and I think it's unfounded. I'm not opposed to people being vegan either.
Yeah.
But if you look at 90% of our livestock probably are in confinement. And so that's a polluting thing in itself. And then they're getting their feed from industrial crop production, which is a polluting thing. And so it's true that that's not good for the environment. But now if you put the animals on the landscape in a way that's ecologically sound, so they actually are building the soil, which we know we can do.
Yeah.
We're sequestering carbon. So we can put the animals on the landscape in a way that's sound.
Yeah.
And it actually will be a positive for carbon sequestration and for the whole environment. Because like with the grazing system I've been describing, it actually will build the soil, whereas the industrial system tends to deplete the soil. And also we have a lot of diversity of the plant. So we're increasing the diversity of the plant community, which is good for the wildlife. And it also will improve water quality, because it's like, someone once asked me when I was giving a talk at a conference if I have any buffer strips on my farm. I said, well, my whole farm's a buffer strip, because it's all in perennial crops at that time, and now I'm doing some cropping too. So it improves the soil, improves the biodiversity in the landscape, it improves the health of the animals. Now cows are eating their natural diet of grass, and they're living in their natural landscape, so they're much healthier. And cows will live a lot longer on the system.
Yeah.
And then also cows eating grass, their milk and meat is higher in omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acids, and other good nutrients. And so it's actually healthier for the people eating the product. So it's healthier on every level if it's done in an ecologically sound manner, the way nature did it,
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Well, this has been a very valuable discussion, and so I would like to thank all of our panelists who are so informed on these urgent issues that we need to consider and act on. I would suggest that at a time when we're all interfacing with candidates for the presidency and thinking about the future, that we need to remind them of the urgent concern of Iowans and all humans for a better approach to our land, to remind them very specifically of restorative processes and the ways in which they can contribute, and we need to remind them of the need for accountability in our military and some honest facing of alternatives to the ways in which we destructively interact with other nations. So thank you for listening.